Hello, welcome back to my channel. I'm gonna continue reading Caliban and the Witch by Silvia Federici. I'm gonna continue to read chapter 4, which is called The Great Witch Hunt in Europe. And we're on this section called Witch Hunting, Women Hunting, and the Accumulation of Labor. The most important difference between heresy and witchcraft is that witchcraft was considered a female crime. This was especially true at the peak of the persecution in the period between 1550 and 1650. In an earlier phase, men had represented up to 40% of the accused, and a smaller number continued to be prosecuted later, mostly drawn from the ranks of the vagabonds, beggars, itinerant laborers, as well as the gypsies and lower-class priests. By the 16th century, moreover, the charge of devil worship had become a common theme in political and religious struggle. There was hardly a bishop or a politician who, in the heat of the moment, was not accused of being a witch. Protestants accused Catholics, especially the Pope, of serving the devil. Luther himself was accused of magic, and so were John Knox in Scotland, Jean Baudin in France, and many others. Jews, too, were ritually accused of worshiping the devil, often being portrayed with horns and claws. But the outstanding fact is that more than 80% of those who were tried and executed in Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries for the crime of witchcraft were women. In fact, more women were persecuted for witchcraft in this period than for any other crime, except, significantly, infanticide. That the witch was a woman was also stressed by the demonologists, who rejoiced that God had spared men from such a scourge. As Sigrid Brauner has noted, the arguments used to justify this phenomenon changed. While the authors of the Malleus Maleficarum explained that women were more prone to witchcraft because of their insatiable lust, Martin Luther and humanist writers stressed women's moral and mental weakness as the origin of this perversion, but all singled out women as evil beings. A further difference between the persecution of the heretics and that of the witches is that in the latter, the charges of sexual perversion and infanticide had a central role, being accompanied by the virtual demonization of contraceptive practices. The association between contraception, abortion, and witchcraft first appeared in the Bull of Innocent VIII, 1484, which complained that by their incantations, spells, conjurations, and other accursed superstitions and horrid charms, enormities, and offenses, witches destroy the offspring of women. They hinder men from generating, and women from conceiving, whence neither husbands with their wives, nor wives with their husbands can perform their sexual acts. From then on, reproductive crimes featured prominently in the trials. By the 17th century, witches were accused of conspiring to destroy the generative power of humans and animals, of procuring abortions, and of belonging to an infanticidal sect devoted to killing children, or offering them to the devil. In the popular imagination as well, the witch came to be associated with a lecherous old woman, hostile to new life, who fed upon infant flesh or used children's bodies to make her magical potions, a stereotype later popularized by children's books. Why such a change in the trajectory from heresy to witchcraft? Why, in other words, in the course of a century, did the heretic become a woman, and why was religious and social transgression refocused as predominantly a reproductive crime? In the 1920s, the English anthropologist Margaret Murray, in The Witch Cult in Western Europe, proposed an explanation which has recently been revived by ecofeminists and practitioners of Wicca. Murray argued that witchcraft was an ancient matrifocal religion to which the Inquisition turned its attention after the defeat of heresy, spurred by a new fear of doctrinal deviation. In other words, the women whom demonologists prosecuted as witches were, according to this theory, practitioners of ancient fertility cults, aimed to propitiate birth and reproduction, cults that had existed in the Mediterranean area for thousands of years, but which the church opposed as pagan rites and a challenge to its power. The presence of midwives among the accused, the role that women play in the Middle Ages as community healers, and the fact that until the 16th century, childbirth was considered a female mystery. All of these factors have been cited in support of this view, but this hypothesis cannot explain the timing of the witch hunt, nor tell us why these fertility cults became so abominable in the eyes of the authorities as to call for the extermination of the women practicing the old religion. A different explanation is that the prominence of reproductive crimes in the witch trials was a consequence of the high infant mortality rates that were typical in the 16th and 17th centuries due to the growth of poverty and malnutrition. Witches, it is argued, were blamed for the fact that so many children died so suddenly, died shortly after birth, or were vulnerable to a broad array of ailments. But this explanation, too, does not go far enough. It does not account for the fact that women labeled as witches were also accused of preventing conception, and it fails to place the witch hunt in the context of 16th century economic and institutional policy. Thus, it misses the significant connection between the attack on witches and the development of a new concern among European statists and economists with the question of reproduction and population size, the rubric under which the question of the size of the workforce was discussed at the time. As we have seen earlier, the labor question became especially urgent in the 17th century, when population in Europe began again to decline, raising the specter of a demographic collapse similar to that which had occurred in the American colonies in the decades after the conquest. Against this background, it seems plausible that the witch hunt was, at least in part, an attempt to criminalize birth control and place the female body, the uterus, at the service of population increase and the production and accumulation of labor power. This is a hypothesis. What is certain is that the witch hunt was promoted by a political class that was preoccupied with population decline and motivated by the conviction that a large population is the wealth of the nation. The fact that the 16th and 17th centuries were the heyday of mercantilism and saw the beginning of demographic recording of births, deaths, and marriages. Wait, here's a wood cut of witches cooking children. The heyday of mercantilism and saw the beginning of demographic recording of births, deaths, and marriages, of census taking, and the formalization of demography itself as the first state science is clear proof of the strategic importance that controlling population movements was acquiring in the political circles that instigated the witch hunt. Here's a woodcut of the drama of infant mortality is well captured by this image from Hans Holbein the Younger's The Dance of Death, a series of 41 designs. Wait, is this one? Oh no. Oh no. And then here is that one. Witches offer children to the devil. A woodcut from a tract on the trial of Agnes Sampson, 1591. We also know that many witches were midwives or wise women. Traditionally, the depository of women's reproductive knowledge and control. The Malleus dedicated an entire chapter to them, arguing that they were worse than any other woman, since they helped the mother destroy the fruit of her womb, a conspiracy made easier, they charged, by the exclusion of men from the rooms where women gave birth. Observing that there was not a hut that did not board a midwife, the authors recommended that no woman should be allowed to practice this art unless she first demonstrated to have been a good Catholic. This recommendation did not go unheard. As we have seen, midwives were either recruited to police women to check, for instance, that they did not hide their pregnancies or deliver children out of wedlock, or were marginalized. Both in France and England, starting from the end of the 16th century, few women were allowed to practice obstetrics, an activity that until that time had been their inviolable mystery. Then, by the beginning of the 17th century, the first male midwives began to appear, and within a century, obstetrics has come almost entirely under state control. According to Alice Clark, the continuous process by which women were supplanted by men in the profession is one example of the way in which they were excluded from all branches of professional work through being denied the opportunity of obtaining an adequate professional training. But interpreting the social decline of the midwife as a case of female deprofessionalization misses its significance. There is convincing evidence, in fact, that midwives were marginalized because they were not trusted, and because their exclusion from the profession undermined women's control over reproduction. Just as the enclosures expropriated the peasantry from the communal land, so the witch hunt expropriated women from their bodies, which were thus liberated from any impediment preventing them to function as machines for the production of labor. For the threat of this stake erected more formidable barriers around women's bodies than were ever erected by the fencing off of the commons. We can, in fact, imagine what effect it had on women to see their neighbors, friends, and relatives being burned at the stake, and realize that any contraceptive initiative on their side might be construed as the product of a demonic perversion. Seeking to understand what the women hunted as witches and the other women in their community must have thought, felt, and concluded from this horrendous attack waged upon them, looking, in other words, at the persecution from within, as Anne L. Barstow has done in her Witch Craze, also enables us to avoid speculating on the intentions of the persecutors. and concentrate instead on the effects of the witch hunt, on the social position of women. From this point of view, there can be no doubt that the witch hunt destroyed the methods that women had used to control procreation by indicting them as diabolical devices, and institutionalized the state's control over the female body, the precondition for its subordination to the reproduction of labor power. But the witch was not only the midwife, the woman who avoided maternity, or the beggar who eked out a living by stealing some wood or butter from her neighbors. She was also the loose, promiscuous woman, the prostitute or adulteress, and generally the woman who exercised her sexuality outside the bonds of marriage and procreation. Thus, in the witchcraft trials, ill repute was evidence of guilt. The witch was also the rebel woman who talked back, argued, swore, and did not cry under torture. Rebel here refers not necessarily to any specific subversive activity in which women might be involved. Rather, it describes the female personality that had developed, especially among the peasantry, in the course of the struggle against feudal power, when women had been in the forefront of the heretical movements, often organizing in female associations, posing a growing challenge to male authority and the church. Descriptions of witches remind us of women as they were represented in the medieval morality plays, and the fabliaux, ready to take initiatives, as aggressive and lusty as men, wearing male clothes or proudly riding on their husbands' backs, holding a whip. Certainly among those indicted, there were women suspected of specific crimes. One was accused of poisoning her husband, another of causing the death of her employer, another again of having prostituted her daughter. But it was not only the deviant woman, but the woman as such, particularly the woman of the lower classes, that was put on trial. A woman who generated so much fear that in her case the relation between education and punishment was turned upside down. We must, Jean Baudins declared, spread terror among some by punishing many, and indeed in some villages few were spared. In the market of Guernsey, England, 3 women are burnt alive. That's crazy. They really did that. Also, the sexual sadism displayed by the tortures to which the accused were subjected reveals a misogyny that has no parallel in history and cannot be accounted for on the basis of any specific crime. Go away. According to the standard procedure, the accused were stripped naked and completely shaved. It was argued that the devil hid among their hair. Then they were pricked with long needles all over their bodies, including their vaginas, in search for the mark with which the devil presumably branded his creatures, just as the masters in England did with runaway slaves. Often they were raped. It was investigated whether or not they were virgins, a sign of innocence, and if they did not confess, they were submitted to even more atrocious ordeals. Their limbs were torn. They were seated on iron chairs under which fires were lit. Their bones were crushed, and when they were hung or burnt, care was taken so that the lesson to be drawn from their end would not go unheeded. The execution was an important public event which all members of the community had to attend, including the children of the witches, especially their daughters, who in some cases would be whipped in front of the stake on which they could see their mother burning alive. The witch hunt, then, was a war against women. It was a concerted attempt to degrade them, demonize them, and destroy their social power. At the same time, it was in the torture chambers and on the stakes on which the witches perished that the bourgeois ideals of womanhood and domesticity were forged. In this case, too, the witch hunt amplified contemporary social trends. There is, in fact, an unmistakable continuity between the practices targeted by the witch hunt and those banned by the new legislation that in the same years was introduced to regulate family life, gender, and property relations. Across Western Europe, as the witch hunt was progressing, laws were passed that punished the adulteress with death. In England and in Scotland by the stake, as in the case of high treason. At the same time, prostitution was outlawed, and so was birth out of wedlock, while infanticide was made a capital crime. Simultaneously, female friendships became an object of suspicion, denounced from the pulpit as subversive of the alliance between husband and wife. Just as women-to-women relations were demonized by the prosecutors of the witches, who forced them to denounce each other as accomplices in crime. It was also in this period that the word gossip, which in the Middle Ages had meant friend, changed its meaning, acquiring a derogatory connotation, a further sign of the degree to which the power of women and communal ties were undermined. Also, at the ideological level, there is a close correspondence between the degraded image of women forged by the demonologists and the image of femininity constructed by the contemporary debates on the nature of the sexes. Which canonized a stereotypical woman, weak in body and mind and biologically prone to evil, that effectively served to justify male control over women and the new patriarchal order. Okay, that was the devil carrying away the soul of a woman who served him, from Rome, 1555. The next section is called Witch Hunting and Male Supremacy, the Taming of Women. The sexual politics of the witch hunt is revealed by the relation between the witch and the devil, which is one of the novelties introduced by the 16th and 17th century trials. The Great Witch Hunt marked a change in the image of the devil compared with that to be found in the medieval lives of the saints or in the books of Renaissance magicians. In the former, the devil was portrayed as an evil being, but one who had little power. A sprinkling of holy water and a few holy words were usually sufficient to defeat his schemes. His image was that of an unsuccessful ill-doer, who, far from inspiring horror, was credited with some virtues. The medieval devil was a logician, competent in legal matters, sometimes represented in the act of defending his case in front of a court of law. He was also a skillful worker who could be used to dig mines or build city walls, although he was routinely cheated when the time came for his recompense. Also, the Renaissance view of the relationship between the devil and the magician always portrayed the devil as subordinate, being called to task, willing or not, like a servant, and made to perform according to his master's will. The witch hunt reversed the power relation between the devil and the witch. It was the woman now who was the servant, the slave, the succubus in body and soul, while the devil functioned as her owner and master, pimp and husband at once. It was the devil, for instance, who approached the intended witch. She rarely conjured him up. After revealing himself to her, he would ask her to become his servant, and what would follow then would be a classic example of a master-slave, husband-wife relation. He stamped her with his mark, had sexual intercourse with her, and in some instances he even changed her name. Moreover, in a clear prefiguration of women's matrimonial destiny, the witch hunt introduced one single devil, in the place of the multitude of devils to be found in the medieval and Renaissance world. And a masculine devil at that, in contrast with the female figures, whose cults were spread among women in the Middle Ages in both the Mediterranean and Teutonic regions. How preoccupied were the witch hunters with the affirmation of male supremacy can be seen from the fact that even when in revolt against human and divine law, women had to be portrayed as subservient to men, and the culmination of their rebellion, the famous pact with the devil, had to be represented as a perverted marriage contract. The marital analogy was carried so far that the witches would confess that they did not dare to disobey the devil, or more curiously, that they did not find any pleasure in their copulations with him, a contradiction with respect to the ideology of the witch hunt, which derived witchcraft from women's insatiable lust. Not only did the witch hunt sanctify male supremacy, it also instigated men to fear women, and even to look at them as the destroyers of the male sex. Women, the authors of the Malleus Maleficarum preached, are lovely to look at, but contaminating to the touch. They attract men, but only to undermine them. They do everything to please them, but the pleasure they give is more bitter than death. For their vices cost men the loss of their souls, and perhaps their sexual organs. A witch presumably could castrate men or make them impotent, either by freezing their generative forces or causing their penis to come out and draw back as she wished. Some stole male penises, which they hid in great numbers in bird nests or boxes, until under duress they were forced to return them to their owners. But who were these witches who castrated men or made them impotent? Potentially every woman. In a village or small town of a few thousand people, where at the peak of the witch hunt, dozens of women were burned in the space of a few years, or even a few weeks, no man could feel safe and be sure that he did not live with a witch. Women fly on their brooms to the Sabbath after applying unguents to their bodies. From 1570. Tight. Many must have been terrified upon hearing that at night some women left the marriage bed to travel to the Sabbat, fooling their sleeping husbands by putting a stick next to them, or hearing that women had the power to make their penises disappear, like the witch mentioned in the Malleus, who had stored dozens in a tree. That this propaganda successfully divided women from men is suggested by the fact that, despite individual attempts by sons, husbands, or fathers to save their female relatives from the stake, with one exception, we have no record of any male organizations opposing the persecution. The exception is the case of the fishermen of the Basque region, where the French inquisitor Pierre Lancre was conducting mass trials that led to the burning of perhaps as many as 600 women. Mark Kurlansky reports that the fishermen had been absent, engaged in the annual cod season, but when the men of the Saint-Jean-de-Luz cod fleet, one of the largest from Basque country, heard rumors of their wives, mothers, and daughters being stripped, stabbed, and many already executed, the 1609 cod campaign was ended 2 months early. The fishermen returned, clubs in hands, and liberated a convoy of witches being taken to the burning place. This one popular resistance was all it took to stop the trials. The intervention of the Basque fishermen against the persecution of their female relatives was a unique event. No other group or organization rose up in defense of the witches. We know instead that some men made a business of denouncing women, appointing themselves as witch finders, traveling from village to village threatening to expose women unless they paid up. Other men took advantage of the climate of suspicion surrounding women to free themselves from unwanted wives and lovers, or to blunt the revenge of women they had raped or seduced. Undoubtedly, men's failure to act against the atrocities to which women were subjected was often motivated by the fear of being implicated in the charges, as the majority of the men tried for this crime were relatives of suspected or convicted witches. But there is no doubt that years of propaganda and terror sowed among men the seeds of a deep psychological alienation from women that broke class solidarity and undermined their own collective power. We can agree with Marvin Harris that the witch hunt scattered and fragmented all the latent energies of protest. It has made everyone feel impotent and dependent upon the dominant social groups, and has furthermore given them a local outlet for their frustrations. By this, it has prevented the poor, more than any other social group, from confronting ecclesiastical authority and the secular order, and making their claims within the redistribution of wealth and the leveling of social status. Just as today, by repressing women, the ruling classes more effectively repressed the entire proletariat. They instigated men who had been expropriated, pauperized, and criminalized to blame their personal misfortunes on the castrating witch, and to view the power that women had won against the authorities as a power women would use against them. All the deep-seated fears that men harbored with regard to women, mostly because of the church's misogynist propaganda, were mobilized in this context. Not only were women accused of making men impotent, even their sexuality was turned into an object of fear, a dangerous, demonic force, as men were taught that a witch could enslave them and chain them to her will. A recurrent charge in the witch trials was that witches engaged in degenerate sexual practices, centering on copulation with the devil, participation in orgies that presumably took place at the Sabbath. But witches were also accused of generating an excessive erotic passion in men, so that it was an easy step for men caught in an illicit affair to claim they had been bewitched, or for a family wanting to terminate a son's relation with a woman of whom they did not approve to accuse the latter of being a witch. Wrote the Malleus, "There are 7 methods by which witches infect the venereal act and the conception of the womb. First, by inclining the minds of men to inordinate passion. Second, by obstructing their generative force. Third, by removing the member accommodated to that act. Fourth, by changing men into beasts by their magic art. Fifth, by destroying the generative force in women. Sixth, by procuring abortion. Seventh, by offering children to the devil. Here's a woodcut of the devil seducing a woman into making a pact with him from 1489. Tight. Oh, did my line fall out? Okay. That witches were accused simultaneously of rendering men impotent and arousing an excessive sexual passion in them is only apparently a contradiction. In the new patriarchal code that was developing in concomitance with the witch hunt, physical impotence was the counterpart of moral impotence. It was the physical manifestation of the erosion of male authority over women. Go away. Go away. Since functionally there would be no difference between a man who was castrated and one who was helplessly in love. The demonologists looked with suspicion at both states, clearly convinced that it would be impossible to realize the type of family the contemporary bourgeois wisdom demanded, modeled on the state with the husband as the king and the wife subordinate to his will, selflessly devoted to the management of the household. If women, with their glamour and love filters, could exercise so much power as to make men the succubi of their desires. Sexual passion undermined not only male authority over women, as Montaigne lamented, but also, as Montaigne lamented, man can preserve his decor in everything except in the sexual act. It also undermined a man's capacity for self-government, causing him to lose that precious head, wherein Cartesian philosophy was to locate the source of capital R, reason. A sexually active woman there then was a public danger, a threat to the social order, as she subverted a man's sense of responsibility and his capacity for work and self-control. If women were not to ruin men morally, or more important, financially, female sexuality had to be exercised. This was accomplished by means of torture, death by fire, as well as the meticulous interrogations to which witches were subjected, which were a mixture of sexual exorcism and psychological rape. For women then, the 16th and 17th centuries did inaugurate an age of sexual repression. Censorship and prohibition did come to define their relationship with sexuality. With Michel Foucault's critique of the repressive hypothesis in mind, we must also insist that it was not the Catholic pastoral nor the confession that best demonstrates how power at the dawn of the modern era made it compulsory for people to speak of sex. The discursive explosion on sex that Foucault detected in this time was in no place more powerfully exhibited than in the tortured chambers of the witch hunt. But it had nothing in common with the mutual titillation that Foucault imagines flowing between the woman and her confessor. Far outstripping any village priest, the inquisitors forced the witches to reveal their sexual adventures in every detail, undeterred by the fact that they were often old women and their sexual exploits dated back many decades. In an almost ritual manner, they forced the alleged witches to explain how in their youth They were first taken by the devil what they had felt upon penetration, the impure thoughts they had harbored. But the stage upon which this peculiar discourse on sex unfolded was the torture chamber, and the questions were asked between applications of the strappado to women driven mad by pain, and by no stretch of imagination can be imagined that the orgy of words the women thus tortured were forced to utter incited their pleasure, or reoriented by linguistic sublimation their desire. In the case of the witch hunt, which Foucault surprisingly ignores in his history of sexuality, the interminable discourse on sex was not deployed as an alternative to, but in the service of, repression, censorship, denial. Certainly, we can say that the language of the witch hunt produced the woman as a different species, a being sui generis, more carnal and perverted by nature. We can also say that the production of the female pervert was a step in the transformation of the female vis erotica, vis into vis lavorativa. That is a first step in the transformation of female sexuality into work. But we should appreciate the destructive character of this process, which also demonstrates the limits of a general history of sexuality of the type Foucault has proposed, which treats sexuality from the perspective of an undifferentiated, gender-neutral subject, and as an activity presumably carrying the same consequences for men and women. This is like super... Oh my god, we're almost done, I think. Oh, no. Alright. So I'm gonna stop there. It's really getting juicy. Thanks so much for watching my video. Please, if you like the video and comment and subscribe and share with your friends. Let me know if there's any other texts that you would like me to read after this. I have some ideas. But anyway, thank you so much.